I'm going to go ahead and start recording the session. So we're glad that you could join us here for our National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance webinar series on things that affect wilderness stewardship organizations around the country. So we're pleased that you found us and can join us today. Again, with me is Dave Cantrell, our Programs Subcommittee Chair, who pulls together these webinars, and Chris Armatas from the Aldo Leopold National Wilderness Research Institute. Great to have you guys here with us today. Getting quite a few more people showing up, so that is good. Just trying to get everybody in. So great, we've got more people here. So we're just getting started, trying to use our new Zoom technology. But I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Chris so that he can queue up our topic for today, and then we'll have time at the end of the session for questions and answers. So just please hang on. Depending on the size of the crew, we might just allow for a free-form open discussion at the end. So please just hang on and we'll go ahead. So Chris, let's go ahead. You've got the floor.
Great, thanks Randy. So you can see that, I sound okay?
Yep.
Excellent. Well, thanks Randy and the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance for hosting. I'm excited to kind of be presenting for this webinar series, and it's always good to engage with the broader wilderness community. And as Randy noted, my name is Chris Armatas, and I'm a research social scientist with the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, which is a federal government research outfit with the Forest Service, or administered by the Forest Service, but we are kind of broader than that in terms of who we serve, and are chartered to support all wilderness land management agencies. So beyond Forest Service to the BLM and the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service as well. And so today I'm going to present some findings related to shared stewardship and presenting some work or some research from the 2019 National Wilderness Workshop in Bend, Oregon. So during a session there, we asked people about shared stewardship and did a little survey and some group discussion. And so this is kind of the results and analysis of that work. And I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues in this, who include both federal agency and non-agency folks, Jimmy Gaudry, Bill Hodge, Heather McSlaro, Michelle Mitchell, and Nancy Taylor. And also want to acknowledge the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance as the host of that 2019 workshop, host of this webinar series, and then also kind of an integral facilitator of the shared stewardship. And so, we closed last year's workshop with an interactive session. And again, it had that survey and what we called kind of an empathy exercise, quote unquote. And so I'm going to jump into the results there and talk mostly about that today, and hopefully leave enough time for discussion, because really it's a kind of a forming topic and understanding, and we're really, as a wilderness community, kind of wading through how to do wilderness shared stewardship and how to build those partnerships. And I'll talk about why we focus on empathy here in a little bit. But just as a presentation outline, in essence, I'm going to distill the report pictured to the right, which can actually be found on the Society for Wilderness Stewardship website, and maybe we can get it, we'll talk to Randy about getting it published or put up here too if folks want to access it, or reach out to me directly and I can provide it to you. We've been circulating it, but as of right now, it's an unpublished report. And in the near future, our plan is to submit kind of a concise version of that report to the right to International Journal of Wilderness for consideration for publication. And first I'll explore the shared stewardship idea a little bit, discuss some of the different contexts it's been considered within, and then present our view of kind of shared stewardship within the wilderness context. And then second, I'll explain the session, the methods of this research. What did we do in Bend, Oregon about a year and a half ago now, or less. And then lastly, I'll cover some insights yielded by this work and highlight a few broad recommendations that may be worthwhile as the idea of shared stewardship is kind of honed and implemented. So what is shared stewardship? I mean, really, I guess it's about collaboration and partnerships broadly. And so, for example, Chief Vicki Christensen of the Forest Service is quoted on the banner page of the Shared Stewardship for that idea, saying it's about working together in an integrated way to make decisions and take actions on the land. And this little screenshot from the 2-minute video on the same webpage highlights 3 primary components, which include working at scale, cross-boundary solutions, and joint priority setting. And while there are some commonalities with wilderness shared stewardship, such as kind of joint priority setting, the shared stewardship being focused on here is primarily related to forest health, vegetation management, and wildfire risk reduction. So it's really that kind of broad approach, kind of what some are calling capital S shared stewardship. I heard that recently. It's represented by formal agreements between states and the federal government. Some of the formal documentation on it is labeled as kind of an outcome-based investment strategy, quote unquote. And so there are resources related to this, you know, like conservation finance programs and various legislative and administrative policy focused on active management. And again, even though there are commonalities and interrelationships, I think with wilderness shared stewardship, you know, that focus on partnerships is a little bit different. And so we were, you know, interested more in that wilderness context. And so what is kind of wilderness shared stewardship? You know, we think of, while the 111 million acre thereabout National Wilderness Preservation System is administered by the federal government land management agencies, partnerships with state and local governments as well as NGOs have played a critical role in ongoing shared stewardship or ongoing stewardship of the NWPS. And so, you know, this includes public-private collaborations focused on clearing and repairing trails, invasive species treatment, inventory and monitoring, planning, tourism promotion, research, educating the public on wilderness issues such as leave no trace and traditional skills, and then conveying kind of the relevance and meaning of wilderness to the youth. You know, these are kind of fundamental, we see, is ensuring that the tenets of the Wilderness Act and the system it created are honored. And so shared stewardship of the NWPS has been ongoing for a while, since the passage of the Act, really in 1974, as reflected through longstanding partnerships, organizations such as the Student Conservation Association. More recently, the effort towards collaborative stewardship of wilderness was formally recognized in 2004 when the 10-year Wilderness Stewardship Challenge was introduced. And then the idea of partnerships to better wilderness stewardship has also been discussed at a number of national wilderness workshops, which are often hosted by NWSA. And finally, we can find some discussion of partnership efforts within wilderness context in the literature as well. But that literature is pretty limited and kind of fairly outdated, being at least 10 years old in most cases. And so part of what we wanted to do with this work at the National Wilderness Workshop in 2019 was to update that literature, check to see if things had changed or if the same challenges were arising that we explored and discussed, you know, or the community explored and discussed over 15 years ago. And so I'll move into that work in a minute, but I just wanted to put a little closure on what we viewed shared stewardship as. More specifically, we kind of articulated it as an ideal. And so, you know, as we discussed, shared stewardship's broadly about collaboration and working together. And it's popped up in a lot of contexts. There's some recent research on trails, and then as mentioned earlier, you know, quite a bit of focus on the context of fire management and risk reduction and forest health. But as part of this work, we were interested in articulating a vision of shared stewardship with a bit more detail. And where we landed, based, you know, in particular on the expertise of those who are actively involved in partnerships within our collaborative group and kind of the co-authors of this report, more than myself. You know, I'm kind of on the science side, and then we had folks kind of working in partnerships or have worked a lot in partnerships. And really we did land on this ideal. And we do think this applies regardless of the context, maybe particularly in wilderness, but, you know, even when you think about the more formal agreements or shared stewardship and trails or working with your, you know, neighbors to reduce fire risk, those types of things, we do think this ideal does apply. And so I'm going to read kind of this somewhat long snippet from our report, but I think it captures it really well. And so in practice, shared stewardship means sharing empathy, learning, risk, reward, opportunity, failure, and success across organizational divides. And it starts from a place of curiosity, humility, and openness. And there are fundamental questions inherent to the shared stewardship process, including what do we know about the resource, its current condition, the context within which it exists and will exist over time, and the condition we hope to leave it in for the future. What ideas do we have in common? What differences of opinion and position do we represent? What are our hopes and fears? And if we move forward together to maximize hope and minimize fear, what good could we affect? And as much as I'd like to kind of claim this writing, Michelle Mitchell, a co-author, kind of put this together, and I thought it was a really nice articulation, concise, and kind of poetic. And it really does, I think, underscore that empathy idea and really needing to understand each other, hopes and fears as well. And so that kind of comes to this point, why did we focus on empathy in this report? And we really honed in on empathy, which is defined as sensing and sharing of feelings of one person by another, because it's so fundamental to strong partnerships. This is reflected in a great deal of literature on collaborative work. Specifically, we adopted this very common framework for collaborative governance, and in particular, the need for trust building and shared understanding, and they're being underpinned by this need for empathy. And in some ways, I think they're probably synonymous. And we've heard quite a bit about, empathy lately in the wilderness community. I'd say during the recent virtual National Wilderness Workshop in particular, there was a lot of discussions and sessions focused on that. And while the context of building relationships or the content of that is different in, for example, pushing the push to foster greater comfort in the backcountry for diverse populations versus fostering empathy in the shared stewardship context, it seems that empathy is kind of that important ingredient regardless. And so, which is to say, as we face challenges of the wilderness community, whether it be a long time needed kind of reckoning with some social problems related to inclusivity and discrimination, or the need to collectively steward 111 million acres of the NWPS, listening, learning, and feeling with others, as Brene Brown notes, is critical. And if you haven't seen it and you're interested in a science-based and kind of concise discussion of empathy, check out this short video but by Brene Brown. She's a psychologist, or a psychology scholar, rather, researcher, scientist, and some of her work's gone mainstream. And it's just a real quick video, so worth your time. And so, I'm just going to say with this idea of trying to create this empathetic space within the wilderness shared stewardship context, what did we learn or what did we do at that workshop? And so in 2019, during the final kind of plenary session at the meeting in Bend, we did two things to have people think about a shared stewardship. We circulated a short survey which asked 5 basic questions, when we gave people about 15 minutes to complete the survey, and we really just wanted to know their role or kind of what they do within the shared stewardship context, the geographic location, where they're doing that work. Did they think it was working? And this was a simple kind of agree to disagree. Why or why not? So this was an open-ended question. Do you think shared stewardship is working? And then maybe some ideas. We asked people some ideas for benefiting shared stewardship in the future. And then second, we commenced what we called kind of this empathy exercise, which consisted of asking people to gather in groups of 10 or so, and then we provided a blank card with a question. And we asked them to write down one thing that causes them worry or anxiety in the context of shared stewardship. And this was an open-ended question. Once everyone had written down the response, they placed the card on the ground in a pile, and then we had the whole room rotate. So a group of 10 people or so kind of came to this different set of cards. And the idea here was, while we couldn't provide anonymity, everyone knew who was in the room, we did want people's answers to be kind of confidential. And so, they could answer in an honest and open way and not feel maybe pressure to speak up, particularly if they had something they felt might be criticized. And so with each group sitting in front of a stack of cards with the shared stewardship concerns listed, we asked them to distribute the cards to that group. Again, they're not their own cards, and read aloud to one another and discuss. And so we asked for notes to be taken from the group discussions. However, the primary purpose of that group discussion was for people to really hear the concerns of others and discuss, those among the group. And while it's a small slice of people relatively, we saw this discussion and focus on empathy among 100 or so members of the wilderness community to be worthwhile. And so it's just kind of a starting place. And if you can do that, in little spots here and there, I think collectively it'll add up to a lot of, shared and increased understanding. And we didn't collect a ton of feedback from the in-room experience, but people did express some positive feelings related to that and to the idea of being able to kind of express how they felt. And then what I did was take all the survey cards, open-ended responses to the empathy question, and the group notes back here to Missoula and did some analysis. And I'm really just going to kind of go into the results of that. I don't get into a ton of methodological description of the analysis other than to say it's kind of qualitative coding, organizing that data into these different themes. And so I'll talk a bit about what we find. And so I know this is a busy table and I won't spend a ton of time on it, but it simply conveys who we heard from. So in the end, we had about 98 usable surveys and empathy cards. And this table summarizes kind of the roles, quote unquote, represented. And so we categorized it into kind of 4 different categories: 41 agency people, 39 from NGOs. We had 11 volunteers and 6 kind of categorized as others. And I wonder if you can kind of read this on your screen. You may just see some organizations from a social science perspective, this sample is what we call a convenience sample. Is who is there. With our population of interest being kind of the wilderness community broadly, however you define that community, there might be some limitations in this sample, as there's most certainly folks who, in the wilderness community who can't or didn't, for whatever reason, make it to this workshop. But as far as convenience samples goes, it's probably a pretty good one. We have a lot of different types of people, the different roles, different perspectives, agency, non-agency. And so we can kind of assume we do have a diverse kind of population of folks here and perspectives. And I'm happy to talk more about general research and science if folks are interested, but for now, I'll just kind of continue into the results. And so where were respondents doing the work? We wanted to know where they were practicing their shared stewardship or engaging in partnerships. And as can be seen, we had kind of a nice scattering of mentions by state. Some mentions were more specific with actual wilderness areas or towns or cities, and others were a bit more broad, some mentions of the entire nation. Unsurprisingly, given the location of the meeting in Bend, Oregon, the most mentions came from that state and the surrounding states. It kind of goes out equally from there for the most part. But it does kind of highlight that there was kind of a broad representation of folks engaged in partnerships and this discussion. And so again, maybe the convenience sample is stronger than some. And just as a quick overview, again, 98 people did it. Mostly agreed that shared stewardship was working. So to that one question, the basic just scale of 1 to 5, we had on an average of like 3.68 out of 5. Most people either somewhat agreed or strongly agreed that shared stewardship was working. Only 11 people out of the 98 disagreed, either strongly or somewhat, that it wasn't working. And then the analysis of the open-ended questions, which I'll spend kind of most of the time on here, yielded 5 themes. And I'll kind of briefly discuss each one in turn, although note that in the report, we really do go into quite a bit of detail. And these 5 themes sometimes, as you'll notice, kind of highlight things that maybe are impeding shared stewardship or facilitating it, because we did ask what's successful or not successful in your eyes, and what are some ideas going forward. And then there's definitely some more personal issues, which are often captured by that empathy exercise comments. Okay, so culture and community. When it comes to shared stewardship, the responses categorized into this theme highlighted much of what may be facilitating or impeding successful shared stewardship. The most common idea mentioned in this theme, which kind of I think cuts both ways, is the passion and enthusiasm of the wilderness community. It is a passionate bunch. I think we all know that. And in some ways, this can be really positive. As one volunteer noted, more people are engaged, they inspire each other. But it might be possible that some passion leads to some of the things that are impeding shared stewardship. Passion may enhance a history of conflict. It may lead to feelings of inadequacy when that passion is accompanied with a high level of expertise. We found this as there were several comments related to kind of feeling inadequate. This came in different contexts, but often those feelings had to do with not feeling up to the job. As one person put it, there were feelings of imposter syndrome. This stemmed from something as simple as not understanding the lingo or the acronyms being used. And in the case of an agency employee who was fairly accomplished and in a position of leadership, they noted a fear of just not being qualified enough to kind of train and supervise interns. And so just to kind of highlight that those feelings of inadequacy weren't necessarily, only held by a new person or a volunteer or something like that. It did kind of seem to span the group quite a bit. And then another idea that came through clearly through, mentions by several, was the idea that wilderness community and inclusivity, or kind of the lack thereof, this idea of a homogenous demographics in wilderness community is something that's been discussed for a long time. Again, kind of mentioned that earlier. And it was the focus of several sessions at the most recent NWW. So definitely have to check out those sessions if you have a chance, if you weren't able to attend. And so I'm not going to go into a ton of time on it, but some of these ideas that came through and what we kind of collected in 2019 was the need to being intentional about building of equity into shared stewardship, so that that is kind of recognized within the community. And the next theme, the need for better communication and coordination, was the most common answer for improving shared stewardship. And generally it was recognized as the keystone really to success. With regard to communication specifically, the need for empathy and better understanding came through. One agency employee indicated that they felt misunderstood by partners. Perhaps this referral here in this quote to a lack of patience was due to a strained relationship where the agency person was perceived as not being responsive. I heard that a couple times. It makes you wonder if the lack of gratitude felt by volunteers stems from agency partners who feel stretched thin or overwhelmed. So that was common, just feeling overworked, like they don't have enough time to get to all these things. And so what may be happening is that all parties in the partnership are feeling stressed and stretched too thin. And without some adequate communication of this, then it's assumed sometimes that there's maybe a lack of interest, or worse, some feelings of dislike, right? I think we can be pretty insecure as human beings. And when we are in a relationship, any relationship, if we feel like we're not getting enough attention or love or what have you, we can sometimes assume the worst and think that we're doing something wrong or that we're not liked in some way. And of course, this probably isn't the case. And so it highlights the importance of communicating those feelings. And that takes time. We recognize that. If you're an agency person and you're not being responsive to emails or things like that, it's not because you probably don't like that partner. It's because you're stretched thin. And so what we learned here, I think, is the importance of at least articulating that. Like, I'm overwhelmed. I can't get to it. I'm sorry. But I hope to continue building this relationship in the future. Something to that effect, I think, could go a long way. And so in regard to coordination, some ideas that came through related to some national leadership, more consistency and centralization, and a better definition of what the shared goals are. This last part on the lack of clarity over shared goals is all over the literature on collaborative governance. It's something the Forest Service stresses in much of their communication, like the joint priority setting. But based on what we heard last year in Ben, there's still a lack of clarity on the topic in the context of wilderness stewardship, or wilderness shared stewardship. And there may be very different priorities between the agency and the non-agency partner. And so articulating those is really important. For instance, the respective missions of partner organizations may influence perspectives on what successful shared stewardship looks like. Instead of miles of trail maintained, which may be a primary agency goal, the partner might be think it's most important to teach youth life skills or something to that effect. And so that disconnect or that difference in alignment is potentially really important to just communicate first and foremost, but also to kind of improve our shared stewardship going forward. And these differences between kind of agencies' goals and partner goals, I think, if well understood, will kind of clarify the expectations among the different entities and highlight, components that can facilitate or impede success. Okay, the third one, comments organized into this theme generally focused on practical issues or solutions facing shared stewardship success. And much of this was suggested for things that are really holding shared stewardship up, such as inefficiencies from duplication of work and the loss of productivity that comes with people's strengths, not aligning with their roles in the process. Specifically, one agency person noted that there's a lack of understanding about what the costs of shared stewardship are. Another area in this theme, which often focused on ideas for moving forward, was related to practical tools. And so several mentioned the need for databases and central locations of information, as well as guides or protocols for improving transparency. 4 people focused on protocols and the creation of the kind of these best practices. And this could connect, I think, to the mistrust in relationships, because as one person noted, quote, "The public and often partners don't understand why or how things happen, breeding mistrust," end quote. And so that transparency, someone here was making that connection between kind of knowing what's going on and trust. And so we also had 6 people focused on kind of central location. So very practical stuff like an online system, central database again. And finally, another common issue outlined under this theme was agency turnover, or the loss of relationships through turnover. The comments that were categorized under this sub-theme varied from the general idea of not having a succession plan when people move from, on from their positions. And actually, this was something that was discussed during the National Wilderness Workshop panel this year in 2020, virtually. And one thing Scott Snelson mentioned as a good idea was for people leaving their positions to provide their incoming replacement with a quote unquote transition plan. And this, according to Scott, was, it's an informal thing, it's not required, but it's definitely something that could go a long way, I think, to facilitating those partnerships. So that was a good kind of applied idea or a practical idea from Scott. And the comments in this theme also underscore the passion and commitment that the people have to wilderness, and the fear that some, that may be lost. And so one NGO person stated, "I worry about, quote, I worry about the future of my wilderness areas. Who will carry the torch," unquote. So, there's real concern about that land. This connection is strong. And then, another person in an internship expressed anxiety about their hard work. And they stated, "My position is an internship, and while the funding is promising to have had the position at all, the lack of a full-time position is leaving my work abandoned. And at the end of my time, where does my investment go? Will there be passion, funding, investment beyond me, or am I just a checked box?" End quote. And so this intern, it's an interesting comment, I think, because it really makes you wonder about the impact that such a feeling might have on their work. How can we expect someone to really commit to the job and to the hard work if they think that effort is, pretty much for naught and is just going to, go into the ether? And so that agency turnover and what happens to that knowledge and that data that's developed maybe by an intern in a year is really important, and more important than maybe just the application. It's also to kind of continue to motivate people to stay invested. All right, the fourth theme that emerged often had to do with those things that people are concerned about or think might impede shared stewardship. Maybe things that aren't all that surprising, such as climate change, and there was some anxiety about, politics influencing policy. And I categorize these into kind of big picture, more external issues maybe, and kind of internal issues, which are still big picture, but more related to wilderness, like connecting with nature. These were a bit mixed. Some people thought we had more connection than ever. Others thought the values were being lost. And then, the other thing, that the inability or the kind of not having the buy-in from agency leadership. One NGO person noted that some people have bought into the shared stewardship model and others haven't. An agency employee reflected on the challenge of persuading leaders about the importance of wilderness stewardship. And of course, if this lack of commitment is widespread, then it can kind of have direct impacts on this next theme, which is probably not news to anybody here. Capacity. There were many comments on capacity. In fact, issues related to capacity was the most common comment, particularly with the context of what is impeding shared stewardship. Of course, the common idea that there just isn't enough time or money or experience to get the work done was a common sentiment. And it was also something that showed up in that previous literature. But also there was a concern about an over-reliance on partners. And this is the idea that partners create capacity that might lead to a lack of investment in agency efforts. And this stresses the importance of viewing shared stewardship as an ideal about how we collaborate as opposed to some supplemental workforce. And so in our report, at the guidance of those authors with more field experience than me, we really stress the point that partners bring diverse ideas and skills that are critical to the future of NWPS, the preservation system. which is a way of saying that even if capacity and funds on the agency side were limited, if we had all the money we could ever dream of having, we would still need and want a strong partnership model. Those ideas and that kind of different perspective is so critical. And so particularly as we look to wanting to kind of diversify relevance and understand how people connect to that resource better going forward. And finally, there were some comments and concerns about the abilities of both agency and non-agency partners. However, perhaps this issue is something that could be improved with better communication and coordination and a better articulation of those roles and strengths. Okay, so this is really what we heard from the wilderness community in Bend in October 2019. But really, where do we go from here, or what did we learn? And this is, this will be my last slide, and then we'll have some time to discuss, hopefully. And so, in our report, we really highlighted two things in the discussion. First are insights. And I start with this kind of heard it already comment, like, okay, tell me something I don't know. Because what we find is that much of what was laid out in the literature previously, even though there's not a ton of it and some of it's outdated, as it relates to challenges and required kind of components, that stuff came through again in our session. That is kind of some of these issues, such as capacity concerns, or some of the needed components, such as wilderness champions or national coordinators, have been discussed previously. And we consider this an insight because it highlights some enduring challenges that have yet to be resolved. And it also suggests that as we go forward, certain things may not change. A lack of capacity might be incrementally remedied, but it's probably not going to be remedied with some massive, large general appropriation. And so in that way, we suggest a next step to really add nuance to the capacity discussion. And for instance, we've heard in the literature that one thing to do is provide volunteers with basic incentives and tokens of gratitude. That was something that was mentioned in an IJW article in 2006. Pay for gas if you can. And we also heard in these results that volunteers don't feel valued or appreciated. And so, we understand that, there may be a challenge in providing even that basic token of gratitude. The need for some dollars to buy pizza, for example, for volunteers, it's not a huge ask, but maybe there's governance mechanisms or something that's going on that doesn't allow this to happen or makes it really challenging. Of course, people can chip in. People on the agency side or folks who are working for the NGOs could chip in, but it shouldn't be on them. And so that's what we mean by adding nuance to the capacity discussion. What is it that just even makes simple tokens of gratitude hard or intractable, and can that be fixed? And that might add kind of, little bits of capacity here and there, and then over time, perhaps that can add up. And so, maybe, those small changes can make a big difference. But another insight was that while issues related to the lack of capacity was the most prevalent within the context of the question on why shared stewardship's not working, the most prevalent theme within the context of kind of the innovative ideas question was communication and coordination. So while people recognize, capacity is the problem, it's impeding us, we're not hearing, I think, a little bit different from the literature, the same calls for, we just got to increase capacity. Now it's kind of more like, well, no, let's communicate better and coordinate better. We can do this. And, which is to say, perhaps there is some resignation to this capacity issue, and looking forward, there's the recognition that we can kind of work with what we have. But we also think it's really important. It's an important part of why empathy is so important, because we do acknowledge that people are working with less than the ideal amount. And so if you can kind of make, those widespread feelings known that there's these issues, then that can be helpful. And it just kind of another reason why the empathy isn't so important is that there are these widespread feelings of kind of misunderstanding and a lack of focus on culture and inclusivity. And of course, with regard to inclusivity, this has been highlighted in the past, and it's worth noting that some progress has been made. Generally, for example, within the Forest Service, the This Is Who We Are initiative is an acknowledgement of that issue and to focus on improving the situation. Some success stories in the context were shared at the 2018 National Wilderness Workshop. such as this Fish and Wildlife Services kind of urban wildlife conservation program, which is focused on inspiring the next generation of outdoor enthusiasts, partly by establishing a refuge presence in demographically and geographically varied cities across the US. And so we recommend wilderness entities kind of studying these examples more and trying to kind of adapt that to the wilderness specific context if possible. And then really in recognition of these insights and the need to clearly define shared stewardship is in the wilderness context, as well as the different roles folks might play in pursuit of the shared stewardship ideal. We just kind of note this broad and basic need to keep talking, to create spaces such as this webinar series and the wilderness workshop that happens annually for people to convene and discuss what works and what doesn't, or what we can do better in the future. And so, you know, with that call to kind of keep the conversation going, you know, I'll just kind of conclude with, yeah, this kind of keep talking. I know it's not groundbreaking, but hopefully we can use the rest of this session to come up with some ideas ourselves. And yeah, and that's it. That's kind of all I wanted to say, and that's about as long as I wanted to talk. So thank you, and I look forward to engaging with folks here.
All right, Chris, thank you. Let me figure out how to get back up and running here. Oops.
Trying to stop sharing my screen, but I'm not sure if I did that.
Okay, well, there we go.
Oh, there we go. Stop sharing. Sorry.
Okay, so what we'll ask is folks in the audience, if you would just type your questions that you might have into the group chat, and we'll start from there. If you do have an interest in dialoguing with Chris, we'll go ahead and unmute you, and we'll see how that goes for now. So I'm going to unmute everybody. And if you've got a question, just feel free to jump on and talk. Oh, there we go. Well, somehow it's not really working. I'm trying to unmute everybody, but it's not necessarily working. So we'll go down and unmute you individually. All right, well, anybody have any questions for Chris? And so, Chris, we will be able to take the publication you talked about, and we can add that to our website here.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll send you that report and post it if people want to see it. And yeah, hopefully we'll have some success with getting it published too, and that'll be certainly a abridged version, a shorter version, you know, and IJW, International Journal of Wilderness, you know, the articles are fairly short. So if folks want to wait for that, that's great.
Okay. So in I wasn't able to attend the workshop session last year. I was too busy running around managing the other aspects of the workshop. But were there suggestions for how to overcome some of the critical obstacles that people faced? I think you talked about one of the obstacles, and that's one or other of the partners just says you don't have enough time to participate, that there's some obstacles there at a local level where agency person is feeling overwhelmed and doesn't really want to reach out to the partner. The partner doesn't feel like they're getting embraced enough to go out and do the shared stewardship. What were the key comments that came out that people wanted to have heard about those situations and how to overcome that. I think that's probably the biggest thing we hear.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fundamental to a good relationship is just to have that clear communication, I guess, and that's kind of what we promote or recommend in this report. But in terms of suggestions for how do you overcome some of those strained relationships or feeling misunderstood, or not feeling valued enough, I don't know that anybody had any kind of silver bullet answers to that, other than one thing that we learned was kind of that increased transparency and communication, which could happen maybe not even at the individual relationship level, although I think that that's critical and probably ultimately the most important, like any relationships we have in life. But also just even that, one of the more practical ideas that seems attainable is the practical, like a database or some best practices. Somebody just talked about, they might not understand why a decision's made. And so I don't know if that's in the context of a specific relationship. One of the limitations of this work is you don't get a ton of detail. If we did, and maybe that's somewhere where science or research or some of the work I do could be involved going forward, would be to get a better intimate understanding of what the issues are. But if you can kind of highlight or be very transparent why certain maybe projects are going forward or not going forward, or a decision's made a certain way, then that might assuage some of those problems. But I don't deal a ton with on the ground kind of partnerships, and so I'm probably not the best person to speak to that. But I think ultimately it just comes down to more clear communication. And if the process of decision making itself can be more transparent, which maybe is what the person was suggesting within the context of a database, or here's what we decided and here's the steps that came prior to that decision, that could probably go a long way, and that might be a little broader than individual relationships.
Did in the conversations that you've had, shared stewardship sort of connotates a two-way street of working on either side of the equation. Often I think the agency looks like, we want to do something, and so how can we use a partner to get that something done? Did it come up at all about the interest of the partner groups, of them having some goals and desires, and how willing the agency was willing to embrace those in accomplishing a shared stewardship where the partner goals also were considered?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point, Randy. And I think that I think I tried to get that on maybe the theme related to, I can't remember if it was the practical tools or the communication one, but yeah, definitely that joint priority setting and making clear about what, the priorities of each group is. And I think in our report, we make that point that, the partner might be interested in teaching youth skills, first and foremost, whereas the agency might be interested in clearing X amount miles of trail. And so that should be made very clear, I think, at the outset of any partnership. But it also highlights a bigger issue, and something we discuss in the report, and something we'll discuss in this article if it should be published, is that there's no getting around that, the agency ultimately has different, or has the decision-making power kind of legally, right? There's this legal, they have to make that, and legally and I'm not a lawyer or even really a policy kind of someone who understands it fully, but, the agency might not really be able to kind of provide that or to relinquish that decision-making power. So ultimately they're making the decision, and that can make relationships and governance and collaboration together challenging, right? Because there's a disparity in power there. And in the report, we get into some of the literature on that, and this idea that, and actually a great thesis that was done in 2011 by a student at the University of Montana, and I may get her name wrong, but I think it was Heather Day. She did 33 interviews with with partner people, and that was good science. She did in-depth interviews, sat down with them, talked about it, and someone made that comment that, well, it's more, is it collaboration or is it cooperation? I know it's a small distinction, and I don't want to get into the weeds about that, but this idea that where can we find places where the collaboration truly comes through? And one of the recommendations we make in the report is maybe ultimately the agency will have that decision about what projects go forward, yay or nay on a project, but can we find ways that the partner has really full control over how that project goes forward? And that's one of the recommendations we make. And so maybe I just ran off on a tangent there, but yeah, it's something that came through, really highlighting or working out those different perspectives and priorities is critical.
Hey, Chris, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, we can.
So I think, so my name is Locken Wood. I work for the U.S. Forest Service out of Fort Collins, Colorado. My question is, it's kind of maybe complicated by the status of people, like the common theme of not having enough capacity, because this actually, I'm wondering if one of the solutions that's ever come up in your discussions is like hiring a different type of person, or like new personnel that would be maybe like professional communicators or professional facilitators that have an eye on communication or an eye on empathy, since so many people in the natural resources come from, say, like hard sciences or from legal side, or from like the legal side of things. It's not like a well-practiced skill amongst many of us. So I'm just curious if that kind of thing ever came up, or if it's just complicated by, if we already don't have enough capacity, how can we add a new type of personnel or a new style of partner?
That's a really good question, Locken. And I think it did come up in these results. I think under the practice theme in the report, we talk about, or under the coordination sub-theme rather, about like better, maybe a partnership coordinator. And I know some of those have been hired maybe more recently. And so specific jobs that focus on partnerships, as opposed to what maybe is sadly the case kind of now in a lot of cases, where it's, somebody doing their wilderness trails recreation job, and then they're also like partnership coordinator for a bunch of volunteers. And so there is a recommendation for those positions. As you know, it's a bit of maybe a catch-22. It's like, we don't have capacity to do this, so we need more capacity. But to your point, more about like getting people in the communications field, or that's not something that came through in these results, but I think it's a really good point. And as a social scientist, that's certainly something I focus on a lot in my work, and looking at like public engagement, even for planning processes outside of wilderness, when we think about forest planning efforts or a new comprehensive river management plan, there's this public engagement bucket where the agencies are meant to engage the public to get their values and, what they want on something. But it's generally seen as kind of this, apart from maybe the science or what have you. So if we can come up with better ways to do that, and I think science can play a role a bit in that communication, and the Rocky Mountain Research Station, for example, has a communications team, but how well that's done, I don't know. But I think it's a really good point. I think there's a really good argument to have facilitators in those positions, and generally, at least in the planning context, and so I'm sure also within kind of the day-to-day wilderness context, if they're hired at all, they're contracted out. So it's not somebody who is a permanent or, kind of a fixture that's there, who can maintain those relationships. Because you can bring in a good facilitator who can improve that communication in that moment, whether it's in a public meeting. But so much of what we're talking about, I think, in partnerships is enduring relationships that, last for years really. And then when those turn over, hopefully you can have somebody who helps pass them along as well. So that's a really good point, and something I'll kind of think about going forward. And that's maybe something we should have put into our report as kind of a recommendation for specifically who you're focused on. Because yeah, you're right. That's what it comes down to. It's a really good idea.
Yeah, thanks for the
Yeah,
response.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of smile because when I started my career, it's been over 40 years ago when I first joined the agency. The agency was just starting to have partnership coordinators, and they did come out of more of a communications background, more of that facilitator type role. And I think it's just unfortunate that as the agency hit budget shortfalls and change in climate of administrations, that we lost a lot of those partnership type coordinators in many different places. I think they still exist in some forests where they have a big workload, and they've kind of morphed into different jobs. But yeah, it's definitely something that is important. Lachlan, you bring up a really good point. That you've got to have those communication skills more so than the natural resources hard skills, because your main emphasis is working with people and not with the land. So, and that's good. Are there any other questions? Go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself. I'm not able to unmute everybody globally, apparently because of the way I set this meeting up, but I think you should be able to unmute yourself individually. If you do have a question or a discussion comment you'd like to bring into the conversation, go ahead and do so. Or type it in chat. We'll bring it into the conversation. We still have time for a few more.
Chris, it's unfair to hit you up publicly with this thought. One of the things that NWSA is committed to doing is putting together relevant best practice papers. I wonder if we could get a small group to start to think about some of the things you said. You've identified many elements here out of the work from Bend about best practice for shared stewardship. I wonder if it would be too much work to pull that into a best practices paper to post on NWSA.
Yeah, Dave. I mean, so best practices on the actual kind of partnerships themselves, or how you create a good relationship, or more the technical side of things, like how you actually like draft up a agreement, or I don't want to put the question back on you, but like what facet, I guess, of the shared stewardship? I mean, all of it or something specific?
The social sciences part of it, as it relates to volunteers, would be our natural focus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something we could work on, particularly, who would be where we could maybe tap some capacity. I don't see any of their names here. Would be the Carhart Center, and they do that training on the kind of, wilderness wide. It's not just Forest Service as well, but the Arthur Carhart Center, and they've got some new folks who have come on board who we should talk to them about that, because they are updating. They have those toolboxes and things like that. And so maybe we could tap into some of their expertise as well. And so, yeah, let's continue to talk about it. I think that's a reasonable request. And we would just need to put our heads together and think about kind of what that would look like generally, and then we can execute it.
Perfect. Yeah, good. Let's talk.
Look forward to it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, unclear if anybody else has any questions. I'm not seeing them pop up on my screen. So I'm going to go ahead and just, we're almost near the top of the hour, Chris. So I want to just say thank you for joining us today. I think this is a conversation that I hope we can continue to carry on because shared stewardship is definitely important to NWSA and to all of our agency partners. So we'll plan on continuing that conversation. I think Dave's point about trying to develop a best practices paper would be beneficial to all parties, and will certainly help try to shepherd that along as time goes on. So in deference to our time, we'll just say thanks everybody for joining today. This has been recorded. We'll put it on our website, and people have access to it into the future. We appreciate everybody joining us today, and we'll still get a better hang of how to use Zoom for our webinars. It's a little bit different than the GoToWebinar platform that we've used in the past, but looking forward to more of these conversations and getting people involved in wilderness stewardship. So our next monthly webinar is scheduled for December 8th, where we'll have a conversation among some of the National Scenic Historic Trail administrators about the link between the National Scenic Historic Trail System and wilderness. And we'll look forward to having that conversation as well. And then as we go into 2021, know that the next National Wilderness Workshop is looking to be hosted in Roanoke, Virginia, probably October, November timeframe next year, with the goal around advocating, the theme and the goal of advocating for wilderness stewardship. So we look forward to sharing more information about that as time goes on, and look forward to carrying on this conversation. Chris, Dave, everybody, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Terrific talk.